sourdough discard, why it's so confusing, how to use it in a recipe that you're gonna bake with. So this would be different than sourdough bread baking. This would be like, I'm gonna make cookies and I'm gonna use discard. Why different recipes call for different kinds of discard. And then we're also gonna make one of our favorite discard recipes together, which is our molasses crinkle cookies. So let's start with, why is sourdough discard so very confusing? And honestly, I think it's just because of the name. The name is honestly a really terrible word to use for discard, because at least here in the United States, when you say something is discard or discarded, you're saying you're getting rid of it. It's trash. It's gonna go into the bin. Like, you're not gonna keep it. Sourdough discard isn't trash. Don't get rid of your discard. You can use it, you can bake with it, you can do so many different things with it. It really should be called the extras or the leftovers, not discard, which makes you think that you should get rid of it. So the first thing that you need to remember is that even though it's called discard, you're not throwing it away, okay? Now, why do you have sourdough discard? I know lots and lots of bakers like to maybe brag, I don't know if that's the right word, but a lot of sourdough bakers like to tout the fact that, oh, I never have any discard. I only feed the amount of starter that I need, so I don't ever have a jar like this sitting in my fridge. Well, that's amazing. But you're gonna need to have some discard or extra starter in order to keep your fridge starter going. If you are always only feeding what you need, then you're never putting anything back into this jar. So this is one of the things that I want you to get used to doing whenever you feed a batch of starter, which, just so you know, this is my discard or my main starter jar that lives in the fridge. And I've been bulking it up lately and adding more into it because I know that I'm gonna do a bunch of baking. This is the sourdough starter. I took a portion out of this jar yesterday. I fed it and I let it rise. And so this is fed starter or leaven. This part right here, I'm gonna use some of this today to make something. I haven't decided yet. Maybe some bread, I'm not sure. But I don't need all of it. So once I take out the portion that I need, which is my fed starter or my leaven, I'm gonna have some extra fed starter in here, and that is my discard. Now, if I didn't want to make cookies or something else with it, that extra amount that's in this jar, I would be scraping right back into my main mother starter jar, and then it goes straight into my fridge and it basically stays in there until I'm ready to bake again. So that's how I keep my starter replenished in the fridge. It also is helping to feed it because it's getting this little batch of fed happy starter, and it goes in there, and the more that you're putting little bits of discard back into your mother starter jar, the less likely it's gonna be that you're gonna get any hooch on the top here. And it also keeps your starter just a little bit more active. It's giving it a little bit of really fresh, active yeast in there, keeping it going, which means when you take some out to bake with it, it's only gonna take maybe one feeding and it's gonna be alive and ready to bake. So that's how you're keeping your mother starter fed and happy, is you're adding discard back into it. I don't ever directly feed this mother starter jar because it's cold, it lives in the fridge, and when you try to feed it cold, it's not really awake, and so it's not going to eat. It's not going to benefit it very much. Putting some of this already active, already fed, happy leaven, the discard from it, back in here, that helps to keep this really happy in the fridge, and it keeps it viable for baking longer. So, any questions on that? I see you all joining. I'm glad that you're here. Hi, Betty. Hi, Bernice. Hi, Judy. If you have questions, pop them down in there. answer any of them as they come up. But just before we move on, just remember, discard doesn't mean you're throwing it away. It means extra or leftover, okay? So now when it comes to baking, let's just talk about when you read a recipe and it says to use, is this sourdough? Yes, this is sourdough starter, and this is the fed starter or leaven. And this jar right here, because Iris is asking, this jar is a mix of my original mother starter as well as lots and lots of discard from different times that I've been baking. And that's why there's more and more in here. And I've been building this up so that I can bake a bunch during this season. So this is all about sourdough starter, okay? But the cool thing is that that starter, also known as discard, we can use in all sorts of recipes. And so the recipe we're gonna make today is one of our favorite molasses crinkle cookies. And when you look at the recipe, which I put it down in the description for this video, I also put the link to our blog down there. If you wanna print the recipe out, go to the blog, print it, and then you can have it all ready to go to bake. Okay, let's see, Silver has a question. Do you need to stir the added discard to your discard jar in the fridge? Yes. So when I take some out of this, which let's just do it right now, okay? I'm gonna take out a portion of it so that you all can see. So here's my fed starter, my leaven. Leaven is the fancy name for the starter that you fed. It's on your counter, it's bubbling, it's rising. This jar feels room temperature. The best way to get yours to wake up is to make sure that it's at 65 to 70 degrees. That's the temperature that natural yeast that's in there, the sourdough starter, it needs to be about that degree in order for it to wake up. So I'm gonna take out the portion that I need today. And I know that it's most of this jar, so I'm not weighing it currently, but taking this out, it's nice and fluffy and soft, and you can see in there's bits left in there, scrapings. That's discard. Not because I'm gonna throw it away, but because it's extra. I don't need it for this recipe. So what I do is, here's my jar for the fridge. I take this whole jar, I scrape all of the bits out as much as possible, and it goes straight into my jar in the fridge. Because here's the reality is, a lot of days I have time to do one part of a recipe. Like maybe I have time to feed the starter, but I'm not actually gonna mix up the dough. Or I have time to mix up the dough, but I don't have time to make cookies with the extra discard, the extra starter or discard. So into the fridge it's gonna go. I put it in there and I stir it up. And you'll notice that sometimes the starter that's in the fridge will start to get liquid on the top. That's hooch. Nothing is wrong with that. It's just that your starter has, it's started to get a little bit hungry essentially. And so it started separating. Adding your discard back in there and stirring it up is going to, in a way, feed your starter. So now it's all mixed up in there. This whole thing is cold, and I am going to put it would go right back into the fridge. And now my jar, you can see it's getting more and more full. This jar is gonna go in the fridge and it's waiting for me in there for the time that I have to bake. Whether I'm going to take a portion out and feed it to make more leaven, to make a loaf of bread or a sourdough bread that needs to slow rise, or I'm going to use it as discard in a recipe. When you use it as discard in a recipe, when a recipe calls for discard, what they're saying is you don't need it to be fed and happy. You need it simply to be part of the recipe. And I would say for the most part, when a recipe calls for discard, it's not gonna need any time, you're not gonna need to let it proof on the counter or proof in the fridge overnight. Those types of recipes are asking for a fed starter, something that's already alive, basically what we just took out of that jar. When a recipe calls for discard, they're saying, hey, this is kind of like adding in a scoop of flour or adding in that salt. This is just an additional ingredient in this baked good. And the reason that you want to use it is that it adds a little extra like tang to a recipe. So we'll put the link below, but we have like really delicious snickerdoodle cookies that we use the discard in, and it makes it tangy and delicious and just adds a little depth to the flavor. Sometimes I will add some of the discard into a recipe for like a sweet pumpkin bread, which we have that recipe as well. We'll put that link below. And what it does in that recipe is it just kind of gives it a depth of flavor, but you're not relying on it to help that recipe rise. It isn't the element that is making it get fluff. It is really honestly just adding this extra flavor, sometimes a little bit different texture. So like the roll recipe that we have on our channel, which we'll put that link below later, that recipe uses discard. It doesn't need to be fed, it's cold from the fridge, and it also uses yeast, like active, fast-acting yeast. So the yeast is actually what makes those rolls rise, and the discard gives it a little extra oomph and a little bit of a tang to the roll. So let me see, I have some questions here. Okay, Rick says, I always have a big jar of starter in my fridge, and then I pull out what I need. Currently I have a big batch of cold proofing in my fridge. Totally. This is totally fine to live in your fridge. It doesn't need to live on your counter. Your main jar of starter doesn't have to live on your counter. Once you get it, so if you started your own starter and it's brand new, then it needs to get to probably about 12 days old before it's strong enough for you to put it into the fridge. I'll put a link below. If you want to start your own starter, we have a great video on that. But once you get it to that point, this can live in the fridge and it doesn't need to take a bunch of your time every day, which is so nice because then you can just bake when you want to. So for this recipe, which is down below, in this bowl, I have creamed the, the half a cup of butter, 1/4 a cup of molasses, 1 cup of brown sugar, and 1 egg. So it's all creamed together, just like we're making cookies, okay? Then what we're gonna do is we are going to add in all of our dry ingredients, which is 2 cups of flour. I'm gonna mix this up real quick. We have baking soda, spices, and you're gonna notice, you're like, oh, it's a little bit dry. And that is because we still need to add our discard. Let me grab my scale real quick. Now, I know, okay, there's lots of recipes that I found online that call for measurements of discard in cups or tablespoons, and I would say if they are calling for that kind of a measurement, use your discard cold from the fridge. In this recipe in particular, I'm going to tell you, you could use it cold from the fridge or you can use it leftover from that like active fed leaven. Either way, this recipe works because I've put it in grams. And the reason why the discard is in grams whenever I am making the recipes with it is because I want it to work whether or not I'm using this fluffy fed starter or leaven, or I'm using it cold from the fridge where it's compacted down and it's a little bit more dense. So if a recipe, if you see one and it says use half a cup of discard, make sure you're using it cold from the fridge. Don't use fluffy active leaven because half a cup of that would be much, much less than half a cup of your dense cold discard. Hopefully that makes sense. So for this recipe, we have our dry ingredients incorporated with our creamed ingredients. And now I'm making sure that my scale says grams because it always likes to go back to like milliliters or something. And now I'm literally, this is my jar from the fridge, cold. It's not bubbly and happy, it's pretty dense. I am going to add in 57 grams of discard. And yes, discard can get mixed in with your mother's starter. It loves to be in there together. And I got just a touch too much, so I'm gonna take some out. There we go. Okay, so here's the thing to think about with your discard. Discard, or starter, is essentially half flour and half water. So when it goes into any kind of baking recipe, you are essentially replacing that much flour and that much water. So if you're brand new to trying to figure out, okay, how do I use discard? Maybe you have like a spiced apple bread or something that is like your family recipe. You love baking it during the holidays, but you're like, how do I use discard in it? I would suggest starting with half a cup of discard. And the reason why we're gonna go half a cup is because half a cup of cold discard is essentially 1/4 a cup of flour and 1/4 a cup of water. So then you go to your recipe and you're gonna look at your recipe, and the easiest thing to adjust first is gonna be the flour amount. So the original recipe for these cookies actually calls for 2 1/4 cups of flour. And so when I added discard into this recipe, I knew, okay, we need to omit 1/4 a cup of flour on the recipe because I'm gonna put about 1/4 of a cup of flour of discard in. Then I had to look at the recipe and think, okay, what is the liquid or the oil ingredient in here that we can adjust, because I just added 1/4 a cup of water essentially into this dough. So on my recipe, I adjusted the butter. The original molasses crinkle recipe actually calls for 3/4 a cup of butter, but when I put my discard in, I cut that butter back by 1/4 of a cup. So half a cup of discard is essentially what I like to start with a recipe when I'm playing around with it to see what happens if I use sourdough discard in this. And I essentially am cutting out 1/4 a cup of the original amount of liquid. So if your recipe, you're making like a bread or something like that, a lot of times they'll call for some milk or cream, oil. Cut out 1/4 a cup of that liquid, and then cut out 1/4 a cup of your flour and add in half a cup of discard and bake and see what happens. I had to adjust this recipe just slightly, and it's how I ended up with exactly 57 grams of discard, because I wanted it to bake up and crinkle really good. So it's a little bit of an experiment. It actually is an experiment, because you're gonna see what's gonna happen when I use discard in the place of the flour and some of the liquid. So that's how you replace the discard with some of the ingredients in an existing recipe. Oh, why doesn't this look like a daily used kitchen? Okay, well, this is a great question. When we remodeled our kitchen, which I'm gonna give you a little tour here. Okay, here's our sink area over here. We have that one little bit of counter space. And then this over here is where our coffee and all of our like gear is. When we remodeled our kitchen, I had one request, and it was that this counter remain clear, because otherwise it just feels like I don't have any space to really work. And so this is our home kitchen. I promise you, you get to come and be in this kitchen with us every time we share a video. And sometimes there's lots of stuff still on the counter, but most of the time we get it cleaned up, because we do have a pretty good system of like, one of us is in charge of the kitchen every morning to clean it up. But yeah, this is our real kitchen. I promise you. Okay, let's see. Other questions. Is there any time when I can replace dry yeast with active starter? Okay, so here's the thing about dry yeast, which is like fast acting, and sourdough starter, which is a natural live yeast, which is not fast acting. If you are going to try to replace traditional yeast with sourdough starter, that's when you're going to want to go deep dive into like, okay, I want to make rolls with sourdough starter. That's going to be that you mix up your dough, just do the stretch and folds. It's going to be kind of like a traditional sourdough recipe, but you're going to need to allow that dough to rest and proof for multiple hours so that your sourdough starter has time to work its way through all of the dough and give it really nice big rise. Active yeast came into play because people didn't want to wait so long for their sourdough or their natural yeast to like work and get rising. And so fast acting yeast came into play because you can mix it up and make that bread the exact same day, but it just doesn't have the exact same like depth of flavor that sourdough does. So yes, you can replace active yeast, but what I would do is I would actually, like, let's say you wanted to make rolls and you wanted it to be that you didn't use any yeast, you're just gonna use sourdough starter, look for a recipe that only calls for sourdough starter. There's lots of them out there. We share our recipes as soon as we have one that we feel like is good enough to share. And so, you know, it takes us a little while to get them out there, but I'll start playing around with full 100% sourdough rolls and we'll make sure that that gets out there soon. But let's see, another question. Yes, oops. Okay, I see some of you are like, yeah, I like my kitchen to not have clutter either. It doesn't, you know, when I'm in the middle of making dinner or something like that, it for sure, this counter fills up and it gets dirty in here, but otherwise we like to keep it kind of clean. Okay, when making a big batch and cold proofing, how soon can you bake the bread? Okay, that's a great question. I'll put the link to that video down below of how we make our big batch of bread or a big batch of dough. When I make the big batch, because I just like to split it up into different days, I make the big batch one day and you can bake a loaf as soon as the next day and it's gonna have great rise, texture, and flavor. If you are in a time crunch and you're like, I just really wanna have fresh bread today, then what I suggest that you do is that you do a different feeding with your starter and you do a 1:1:1 ratio. The reason why is when you feed your starter those smaller amounts, it acts faster because it's more starter to eat through, less flour. When you do our like larger starter feeding where we have you do 50 grams of starter and then 200 grams of flour and water, that's a 1:4:4 ratio, which is a slower rise because there's a smaller amount of starter to eat through all of that flour, which in turn makes a bread that can stay, or a dough that can stay in the fridge longer because it's acting a little bit slower. If you want to make one and it's faster, then you want to do a 1:1:1 ratio so that you have this really fast acting starter. And then once you do that final stretch and fold on your dough, shape 900 grams of it either for a sandwich loaf or your rustic oval or whichever bread you're wanting, and then let it proof on the counter shaped for at least 4 hours, then bake. But I'm gonna tell you, that if you make the dough, you shape it, you have it in, okay, like I have one right here. This is a sandwich loaf, shaped, covered, resting in my cast iron pan. I shaped this a day and a half ago, and tomorrow morning I'm going to pull it out and I'm gonna bake it straight cold from the fridge. If you can at least let your dough rest in your loaf pan or banneton basket overnight in the fridge, you will have like light years better bread. There is some magic that happens when you cold proof. And so that's what this is doing. It's cold proofing, but it's cold proofing in the pan that I'm actually gonna bake it in, which means it gets to slow rise in the fridge. And then when we put it in the oven, it's gonna get big and fluffy and it has better texture, better flavor. So, the quick answer to your question is when you make that big batch, shape at least one loaf into a banneton or a sandwich loaf pan, cover and allow it to cold proof in your fridge overnight, and bake the next morning. You're gonna get the best bread that way. And we'll make sure that those links are down below as well. Oh, somebody's saying, Judy's like saying she loves the bowls. We'll make sure that the link to these are below too. They are so pretty. I love baking with them. I know lots of people talk about not using metal when they do sourdough. I learned from my sourdough guru who always used metal bowls. Her bread was always delicious. I don't worry that much about it. I just use what I have and what we like to have around. So use metal if you want to. Hello, Josh from Tasmania. Whoa, hello. Thanks for being here. I'm glad that you're here. It's amazing that we can connect online across the world. So cool. So let's mix up our the rest of our cookies, and I'll be watching up there to see, are there other questions? So I'm getting that sourdough starter mixed in, and it's making my dough nice and soft, and I'll show you as soon as it's all mixed in there. And this whole recipe we put down below, so you all can make them too. One of the things that we like to do with these is, okay, enough of that noise. Okay, here's the dough now. Look at that. It is, oh, I wish you could smell it. It just smells so delicious. Molasses and cinnamon, ginger. And one of the things that we like to add into it, if you can find crystallized ginger, so here's what it looks like. If you can find crystallized ginger at your local stores, buy just enough. Like, I keep a little jar of it on hand, and I'm gonna chop it up. I'm gonna add that in. And another thing, which I'll share this recipe too, we don't have a video yet for it, but I have a blog, is I am going to chop up and add candied orange peel into this molasses crinkle recipe. Oh my, it's like you take a bite and you get like a little bit of that crystallized ginger, some of that candied orange peel in the midst of these molasses cookies. They are so delicious. We love having them around for the holidays. And one of the cool things is that a lot of times I'll make a double batch of this so that we have more dough. And I portion out a bunch of it. I freeze it already in cookie dough balls. And then whenever we want to have fresh cookies, you can just take some of them out of the freezer. But the last trick to these cookies is that you roll them in some crystallized or like raw sugar, and it gives the outside just a little bit of a crunch. They have to chill before we do that. So I'll put a link below. I think I have another little short on how we make these so that you can see how that is done. But I think that covers all of the discard goodness. So one refresher. If you are going to create your own discard recipe, you're going to take that family favorite spiced bread or whatever it is, or cookie, and you're going to use discard. Start with half a cup. And then remember, okay, half a cup of discard is essentially 1/4 a cup of flour and 1/4 a cup of water. And so you're gonna look at your recipe and you're going to take out 1/4 a cup of the flour on that recipe, write it down so that you know exactly what you did, and then you're gonna omit 1/4 a cup of some kind of liquid ingredient in that recipe. You're gonna bake, you're gonna taste, and if by chance you're like, it seems like it's a little bit too wet, use a little bit less discard in the next one. I have found, like, even the molasses crinkles, when I use the discard in them, it takes like 1 extra minute for them to bake. I think it's because water is different than butter, and I swapped a little bit of butter for the water. They still taste amazing, and in a way they're even healthier because they had a little bit less butter. I mean, can a cookie be healthy? I don't know. Okay, another question that I know will come up is, what if you feed your starter with rye flour, or what if you feed it with whole wheat flour? It's just gonna add a little bit more depth of flavor to whatever you're baking. You can use any kind of discard. When a recipe calls for discard, it doesn't mean that it has to only be like unbleached flour or bread flour. You could use any kind of discard that you're already making. You're simply replacing, remember, it's just replacing some of the flour and the water. So I'm glad that we could bake together. We have another live that we're gonna do next week, which we don't normally do them back to back, but you guys, we are almost at 50,000 subscribers, and we just love that you're all coming and you're joining us here in the kitchen. So I've been playing around, and I think it's what I'm gonna play around with today, is making our family favorite cinnamon rolls with the sourdough discard, and I'm getting that recipe already so we can share it with you next week. So if you're available again next week on Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, come join me in the kitchen. We are gonna mix up a batch of cinnamon roll dough together and just celebrate that we have 50,000 people that wanna bake and have fun with sourdough and in the garden and at the table. And there's just so much goodness to share, and we're glad that you're here to be part of it. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon.